For generations, families around the world trusted one simple promise, that Johnson & Johnson products were safe. Long before courtrooms, lawsuits, and billion-dollar verdicts, the company's name stood for care, cleanliness, and protection. In American homes, especially in nurseries and bathrooms, Johnson & Johnson became part of daily life. Parents used its products without fear, believing they were doing the best for their children. That trust did not appear overnight. It was carefully built over decades, starting in a time when medicine itself was dangerous and often deadly. In the late 1800s, surgery was terrifying. Patients feared infection more than the operation itself. Doctors worked with unwashed hands and reused instruments covered in blood. Many patients survived the knife, only to die days later from infections no one understood. Invisible germs were not yet accepted as real threats. Hospitals were places of suffering, not healing. It was in this world that Robert Wood Johnson, a young American businessman, encountered a revolutionary idea that would change his life and the future of medicine. In 1876, Robert Wood Johnson attended the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Millions came to celebrate America's 100th birthday. But Johnson was not there for the inventions or entertainment. He attended a medical lecture by a British surgeon named Joseph Lister. Lister spoke about something most doctors dismissed as nonsense, that tiny organisms caused infection and death. He explained how cleaning hands, sterilizing tools, and using antiseptic materials could save lives. Most of the audience laughed or argued with him. Johnson did not. He listened carefully and saw something powerful. He saw a way to prevent suffering on a massive scale. Johnson had worked in medical supplies for years. He had seen patients die from simple wounds. What Lister described made sense to him. In the 1880s, Johnson joined forces with his brothers, James and Edward. Together, they founded Johnson & Johnson in 1886 in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Their goal was simple but ambitious: to create ready-to-use sterile medical products that any doctor could use safely. This was a radical idea at the time. The company began with sterile surgical dressings sealed in individual packages. Doctors no longer had to prepare materials themselves in dirty hospital rooms. Johnson & Johnson did something even smarter. They educated doctors. They printed thousands of free manuals explaining modern antiseptic surgery, all while subtly promoting their own products. It worked. Doctors began to trust the company not just as a supplier, but as a partner in saving lives. As the company grew, so did its reputation. Johnson & Johnson expanded into maternity kits, first aid supplies, and hospital products. Their message was always the same: safety first. Trust us. By the early 1900s, the company had become a leader in healthcare, and its name carried weight. One of the most famous Johnson & Johnson products was born not in a laboratory, but in a kitchen. Earl Dixon, an employee, noticed his wife frequently cutting her fingers while cooking. He created a small adhesive bandage using gauze and tape so she could protect her wounds easily. The company turned this idea into Band-Aid. At first, sales were poor, but Johnson & Johnson kept improving the product and gave them away to Boy Scouts. Soon, Band-Aid became a household word. This story perfectly captured the company's early spirit, solving real problems for ordinary people. That spirit reached its peak under Robert Wood Johnson II, the founder's son, often called the General. He believed deeply that a company had responsibilities beyond making money. In 1943, during World War II, he wrote what became known as the Johnson & Johnson Credo. It stated that the company's first duty was to patients and customers, then employees, then communities, and only last to shareholders. This idea was revolutionary in corporate America. Under his leadership, Johnson & Johnson expanded worldwide. Factories opened across the globe. New medicines and medical devices were developed. The credo guided decisions and shaped the company's identity. For decades, Johnson & Johnson was admired not just for its success, but for its values. It became one of the most trusted companies in the world. But trust, once earned, must be protected. And beneath the company's clean image, cracks were forming, within the family itself, and eventually within the corporation. The same name that stood for healing would one day be linked to tragedy, secrecy, and betrayal. The foundation had been built strong, but the future would test whether those values were real or just words on a wall. Johnson presented itself as a model of responsibility. The Johnson family itself struggled with deep internal problems. One brother followed the credo, another ignored it completely. The contrast between public trust and private chaos would become a warning sign of what was to come. Robert Wood Johnson II dedicated his life to the company. His younger brother, John Seward Johnson, chose a very different path. He lived in luxury, surrounded himself with wealth and art, and made choices that would haunt the family for generations. His personal life was filled with broken marriages, bitter disputes, and disturbing accusations. One of his daughters, whose baby face once appeared on Johnson's baby powder bottles, later accused him of abuse. Whether fully proven or not, the accusation shattered the family's image. After Seward Johnson's death, his final will left most of his fortune to his much younger wife, a former maid. His 6 children were largely cut out. What followed was one of the ugliest inheritance battles in American history. The trial exposed secrets, resentments, and decades of emotional damage. Lawyers became rich. Family members became enemies. The Johnson name was dragged through headlines, no longer associated only with healing. At the same time, Johnson & Johnson faced one of its greatest public tests. In 1982, 7 people in the Chicago area died after taking Tylenol capsules that had been poisoned with cyanide. The tampering did not happen in company factories. Johnson & Johnson was technically not at fault, but the public was terrified. The company's response became legendary. Guided by the credo, executives pulled every bottle of Tylenol off store shelves nationwide. It cost over $100 million. They warned the public openly, cooperated fully with authorities, and redesigned packaging to prevent future tampering. Tamper-proof seals became the industry standard. Within a year, Tylenol regained public trust. Johnson & Johnson was praised as a model of corporate responsibility. This moment mattered deeply because it proved something important. The credo could work. When faced with a crisis, the company chose people over profit. It showed that values were not just decoration. They could guide real decisions. But this success created a dangerous contrast. When future crises came, the public would expect the same honesty and courage. And when Johnson & Johnson failed to meet that standard, the disappointment would be far greater. As years passed, the Johnson family continued to suffer. Several heirs died young from drug overdoses and accidents. One descendant, Casey Johnson, died alone after failing to manage her diabetes. She had grown up wealthy but troubled, surrounded by privilege without purpose. These personal tragedies did not directly affect the company's balance sheet, but they symbolized something deeper. Wealth without responsibility, inheritance without guidance. The credo guided factories and recalls, but it could not guide broken families. Still, Johnson & Johnson remained one of the most powerful healthcare companies in the world. Its products were everywhere. Its reputation, though scratched, remained strong. Most people still trusted the name. That trust would soon face its greatest challenge, not from a criminal outsider, as in the Tylenol case, but from inside the company itself. The product involved was one of the most innocent-looking items imaginable: baby powder. The bottle looked harmless: white plastic, soft shape, familiar scent. Johnson's baby powder had been used for over a century. Parents sprinkled it on infants. Adults used it daily. But Hidden inside the story of that powder was a secret that would undo decades of trust. Baby powder was made from talc, a natural mineral mined from the earth. In many places, talc is found near asbestos, a known cancer-causing substance. As early as the 1950s, tests showed that some talc used by Johnson & Johnson contained asbestos fibers. Internal company documents revealed that executives and scientists knew this. Instead of warning the public, the company debated acceptable levels, challenged regulators, and kept selling the product. In the 1970s and 1980s, scientific studies began linking talc use in feminine hygiene to ovarian cancer. Warnings grew louder. Johnson & Johnson publicly denied the risks. Internally, they discussed them. Marketing efforts increasingly targeted communities that already used the product heavily, including Black and Hispanic women. For decades, the bottle stayed the same. Trust us. Then came the lawsuits. Thousands of women claimed that long-term use of baby powder caused their cancer. Courts uncovered internal memos, lab results, and strategies that suggested the company knew more than it admitted. Juries began awarding massive damages. One case became billions. Another awarded punitive damages meant to punish, not just compensate. Johnson & Johnson responded, not by recalling the product immediately, but by fighting in court. The company used a controversial legal strategy known as the Texas two-step, creating subsidiaries to shift liability and attempt bankruptcy protection. Courts rejected the maneuver multiple times. Public trust eroded further. Eventually, the company stopped selling talc-based baby powder in North America, then worldwide. Cornstarch replaced talc. But for many, the change came too late. Lawsuits continue. The name that once meant safety now appears in courtrooms. The contrast is impossible to ignore. In 1982, Johnson & Johnson recalled Tylenol at enormous cost to protect the public. In the talc crisis, the company denied, delayed, and defended. The credo remained framed on the wall, but critics argued it was no longer followed. The founders built a company to prevent infection and protect the vulnerable. Their invention saved countless lives. Their values shaped a generation of business leaders. But values are not inherited automatically. Each generation must choose whether to live by them. Today, Johnson & Johnson remains a global giant worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It funds hospitals, research, and foundations. It also funds legal defenses. The same fortune heals and harms, protects and resists. The bottle still exists, though the formula has changed. Whether the company will ever fully regain the trust it once held is uncertain. Courts will decide legal responsibility. History has already judged the cost of silence. This is what remains: a powerful company, a fractured family, and a lesson written in pain. Trust is hard to earn and easy to lose. When doing the right thing costs more than profit allows, the choice reveals who you truly are. By the time Johnson & Johnson stopped selling talc-based baby powder around the world, the damage was already done. For decades, the product had been used daily by millions of people who never questioned its safety. Parents trusted it. Doctors rarely warned against it. Stores kept it on shelves next to diapers and soap, reinforcing the idea that it was harmless. When the lawsuits finally forced the company to change course, many asked the same question: why did it take so long? Part of the answer lies in how large corporations interact with regulation. In the United States, product safety rules often depend on companies reporting problems honestly. Regulators such as the Food and Drug Administration rely on data provided by manufacturers. In the case of Johnson & Johnson's baby powder, internal tests showing asbestos contamination were not always shared. When regulators investigated, they were reassured. Industry self-regulation was promoted. Years passed without firm action. This gap between what companies know and what the public is told is not unique to Johnson & Johnson. But the company's long history of trust made the consequences far worse. When a lesser-known brand fails, the public feels angry. When a trusted name fails, the public feels betrayed. Trust magnifies both success and failure. As lawsuits increased, Johnson & Johnson's legal strategy became a story of its own. Instead of settling all claims early, the company chose to fight case by case. Executives argued that the science was unclear and that the product was safe. Plaintiffs argued that the science was ignored when it was inconvenient. Courtrooms became the place where history, science, and morality collided. The bankruptcy strategy shocked many observers, creating a separate company to absorb legal risk while protecting the parent corporation was legal under certain conditions. But critics argued it violated the spirit of justice. Judges repeatedly rejected the move, stating that Johnson & Johnson was not a struggling company in need of bankruptcy protection. It was one of the richest corporations in the world. Each rejection damaged the company's image further. At the same time, the healthcare industry was changing. Public patience for secrecy was shrinking. Social media allowed victims to share stories directly. Investigative journalism exposed internal documents faster than ever before. What once could be buried in filing cabinets now became headlines. The Johnson & Johnson story also raised deeper questions about corporate culture. How does a company founded on care slowly drift toward denial? The answer often lies not in one decision, but in many small ones. A test result questioned, a memo softened, a delay justified. Over time, protecting the brand becomes more important than protecting the user. Employees inside large organizations often do not see themselves as villains. Most people come to work believing they are doing good, or at least doing their job. But systems reward silence and punish troublemakers. Whistleblowers risk careers. Executives answer to shareholders. Legal teams are trained to minimize liability, not maximize truth. The credo that once guided Johnson & Johnson was meant to counteract these pressures. It placed customers first, but a document alone cannot enforce morality. It must be lived, repeated, and defended, especially when it becomes inconvenient. Younger generations of consumers now look at Johnson & Johnson differently. Many grew up hearing about the Tylenol recall as an example of corporate courage. They now hear about Talc lawsuits as an example of corporate avoidance. Both stories are true. That contradiction defines the modern legacy of the company. In recent years, Johnson & Johnson has attempted to move forward. It restructured, separating its consumer health division from pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Leaders spoke about transparency and lessons learned. Settlements were discussed, but reputations heal slowly. For some families who lost loved ones to cancer, apologies and press releases mean little. The Johnson family itself has largely faded from public view. Foundations continue to fund medical research. Buildings still carry the family name. But the idea of a unified dynasty guiding a moral enterprise is gone. The family story mirrors the corporate one. Success followed by fragmentation, wealth followed by loss. The Johnson & Johnson case is now taught in business schools, not just as a success story, but as a warning. It shows how values can guide a company through one crisis and fail to protect it in another. It demonstrates how power can delay accountability, but not erase it. For regulators, the story has reinforced the need for stronger oversight and independent testing. For consumers, it has encouraged skepticism, even toward familiar brands. For corporations, it has become a reminder that trust is not permanent. It must be earned repeatedly. In the end, Johnson & Johnson did not destroy itself overnight. It slowly weakened the foundation it inherited. The founders believed that protecting the vulnerable was good business. For a time, they were right. Later leaders learned that hiding risk could also be profitable, at least for a while. History shows that every great institution faces moments when it must choose between short-term protection and long-term integrity. Those choices define legacies more than profits or products ever could. The Johnson & Johnson empire still stands. Its products are still used. Its influence is still vast. But the illusion of purity is gone. What remains is a complicated truth, a company capable of great good and serious harm, guided at times by conscience and at times by fear. And that truth, once revealed, cannot be put back into the bottle. As the Johnson & Johnson story moves forward, it no longer belongs only to the company. It belongs to consumers, regulators, doctors, and future business leaders who will study it for decades. This is no longer just the story of a baby powder or a legal battle. It is a lesson about how power, trust, and time can shape the fate of even the most respected institutions. For many people around the world, Johnson & Johnson was not just a company. It was part of daily life. Its products sat in bathrooms, hospitals, and homes. They were used during moments of birth, sickness, and care. This deep emotional connection made the scandal more painful. People did not just feel misled. They felt personally hurt. One of the biggest lessons from this story is that reputation can be more fragile than profit. A company can lose billions of dollars and recover. But once trust is damaged, rebuilding it takes generations. Johnson & Johnson spent over a century building its image as a caring brand. That image cracked, not because of one mistake, but because of long silence. Another lesson is about listening early. Many of the women who later filed lawsuits had raised concerns years before. Their voices were small compared to the size of the company. But history shows that small voices often speak the loudest truth. When companies ignore early warnings, those warnings do not disappear. They grow louder with time. The story also highlights the limits of science when mixed with business pressure. Scientific studies rarely give simple yes or no answers. There is often uncertainty. But uncertainty should lead to caution, not denial. In this case, caution came too late. When companies choose to wait for perfect proof instead of acting on reasonable concern, people can suffer. Globally, the impact has been wide. Countries outside the United States watched closely as the lawsuits unfolded. Some governments reviewed their own product safety laws. Consumer awareness increased. Products that were once trusted without question began to be examined more carefully. Johnson case helped change how people think about everyday items. The role of media cannot be ignored. Investigative journalists played a key role in bringing internal documents to light. These reports did not rely on emotion. They relied on facts, emails, and test results. This showed the power of free and persistent journalism in holding large institutions accountable. At the same time, social media changed the balance of power. Victims did not need to wait for court verdicts to be heard. They shared stories online. They connected with others who had similar experiences. These personal stories made the issue human, not just legal. They reminded the world that behind every lawsuit was a real life. Johnson & Johnson's restructuring marked the end of an era. By separating its consumer health business, the company attempted to draw a line between past and future. Some saw this as a practical business decision. Others saw it as an attempt to distance the brand from controversy. Either way, the old image of a single unified moral giant was gone. For future business leaders, this story offers a clear warning. Ethics cannot be treated as marketing. Values must guide decisions when no one is watching, especially when profits are at risk. A company's true character is revealed not in success, but in how it handles danger and doubt. The Johnson family's original vision still matters. Their belief that serving people ultimately serves business was not wrong. What failed was not the idea, but the commitment to it over time. This shows that values must be protected actively. They do not survive automatically as companies grow. There is also a lesson for regulators. Trusting companies to police themselves has limits. Independent testing, transparency, and strong enforcement are essential. Regulation should not be seen as an enemy of business, but as a protector of public safety and long-term stability. For consumers, the lesson is both empowering and sobering. Familiar brands should not be blindly trusted. Labels should be questioned, information should be sought. But consumers should not have to become scientists to stay safe. That responsibility ultimately belongs to companies and governments. As years pass, the legal battles will fade from headlines. New products will be launched, new executives will take charge, but history will remain. The Johnson & Johnson story will stand as a reminder that even the most respected names are capable of serious mistakes. In the end, this is not a story about evil or good. It is a story about choices. Choices made slowly, quietly, and often out of fear. Fear of loss, fear of blame, fear of damaging a brand. Those fears led to silence, and silence caused harm. True accountability is not only about paying settlements. It's about admitting failure, changing systems, and honoring those who are hurt. Whether Johnson & Johnson fully achieves this remains to be seen. But the world is watching more closely than ever before. Every generation inherits institutions built by the previous one. What it does with that inheritance defines its legacy. Johnson & Johnson inherited trust. How it chose to protect or risk that trust has become one of the most important corporate lessons of the modern age. And that lesson is simple, yet difficult. Care cannot be claimed. It must be proven, again and again, through action. When the lights fade on the Johnson & Johnson story, what remains is not a courtroom verdict or a financial number. What remains is a question, one that reaches far beyond a single company. It is a question about how trust is created, how it is lost, and whether it can ever be fully restored once broken. For more than a century, Johnson & Johnson stood as a symbol of care. Its products were part of the most private moments of human life: birth, illness, healing, and loss. The company did not just sell items. It sold reassurance. It sold the feeling that someone somewhere had thought carefully about safety before the product ever reached a home. That feeling is powerful, and when it fades, it leaves a silence that is hard to ignore. The people affected by this story are not statistics. They are mothers, daughters, families, and caregivers. Many trusted a brand without reason to doubt it. Some paid a price they never imagined. For them, the story does not end with documentaries or headlines. It continues in memories, in empty chairs, and in unanswered questions. At the same time, the story reminds us that institutions are made of people. Decisions are not made by logos or buildings. They are made in meetings, emails, and quiet moments of choice. Each decision may seem small at the time, but together, they create outcomes that shape lives. Johnson & Johnson's founders believed that doing the right thing was the best business strategy. That belief carried the company through its early years and many challenges. But beliefs alone are not enough. They must be defended, especially when they become inconvenient or expensive. The modern world moves quickly. Products are launched faster. Information spreads instantly. Mistakes are harder to hide, and forgiveness is harder to earn. In this environment, transparency is no longer optional. Silence is no longer safe. For future companies, this story serves as a mirror. It asks leaders to look closely at their values and ask whether they are practiced or simply printed. It challenges them to listen sooner, act faster, and place human safety above legal protection. For consumers, the story encourages awareness, not fear. It reminds us to ask questions, to stay informed, and to remember that trust should be given carefully, even to familiar names. But it also reminds us that responsibility should not fall only on individuals. Systems exist to protect the public, and they must be strong. For society, the Johnson & Johnson story shows that accountability, though slow, is possible. It may take years, it may face resistance, but truth has a way of rising, especially when people refuse to remain silent. As time passes, new stories will take its place, new companies will rise, but this story will remain, quietly shaping how those promises are heard. Because in the end, the most valuable asset any institution can possess is not money, influence, or size. It is trust. And once lost, trust leaves behind a simple reminder that caring is not something you say. It is something you must prove every single day.